Hi, I'm Shandon from Kubesale, and today we're going to talk about Skaffold and how to develop Node.js applications on a local or remote Kubernetes cluster. So let's get started with Skaffold. The basic configuration file you're going to be talking about is the skaffold.yaml that lives in the root of your repository and essentially acts like the glue between your code bases, the directory full of files that is your application, and the living deployment of that application in production, CI, development, etc. So the two main sections you'll want to concern yourself with is this list of artifacts and the way to deploy the artifacts. So just like any good Docker file, we've got ourselves an image name here, calling it app. The context for this is a directory, so this is a Docker context. It's going to be this directory app here. Notice inside we have our Docker file. Inside is a fairly normal looking JavaScript application. We're also going to tell Skaffold that we can synchronize any of the files inside of this directory into this container. This will enable live development, as you'll see, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. We're also going to say how we deploy our applications. So there's many options here. But we're going to be using Customize, which is sort of one step up from basic Kubernetes YAML. But you can use just kubectl. You can also use Helm. There's many options here. We recommend Customize typically. This is going to point at the environment that we're targeting. So in this case, we have one environment, our dev environment. Our dev environment here is going to be including our basic app YAML. This will look familiar if you're familiar with Kubernetes. This is basic deployment. It deploys one copy of our Kubesale app. The only important thing to note here is that we're going to go ahead and expose a port, and we're going to go ahead and pull in some environment variables. So, with that said, we have all we need with our one Skaffold file here to do remote development. Let's start by just running Skaffold dev. I'm using Kubernetes via Docker for desktop here on Windows. And most people would shy away from development on Windows. But in this case, since all of my activity is going on inside of the container, there's really not much to be afraid of. I'm never installing, for example, JavaScript dependencies on my Windows machine. I would never compile native modules for Windows. All of my development is happening inside of the container. So if it works for one developer, it's going to work for all the developers. So Skaffold dev is obviously the development environment. The goal here is to both deploy our application, but also follow the logs, port forward any services that we might need to access while we're developing. You saw earlier we had a web server, so we'll get to that. And then also update any changes. So simple Skaffold dev will go ahead and deploy our deployment, deploy our service. This is the port we were talking about. And our app is up and running. Now, you can take a look at the JavaScript that powers this app. Quite basic, just an express server, and it pulls in an environment variable. So one of the most important details here is that obviously we have reloaded. And Skaffold will go ahead and know that because this container relies on the files that we've changed, that it needs to go ahead and rebuild and deploy a new container. So you'll notice actually we built and deployed a new image here based on the git hash, and our code is up and running, reloaded. Now some developers might not like that you rebuild the container every time, and that's entirely optional. There's ways to get around that. Certainly developers who use something like hot reloading or nodemon, etc., those technologies can also be pushed inside of the container. And if you guys are curious about that, please let us know, and we'd be happy to do a follow-up video that would talk about that. But for now, we've got most of what we need. We can remotely develop. We can develop targeting any Kubernetes cluster. So this Kubernetes cluster just happens to be my local machine here, powered by Docker for desktop. But I can just as easily use a cluster of Raspberry Pis, the servers in my closet, for example, a server on Amazon, etc. So more important than just syncing files, we also would like to have access to the web server. So you can see here that we see hello world, That's actually quite easy, thankfully. We can just add the port forward flag to our Skaffold dev. And there we go. We can see that the remote port has been forwarded to our local port. So we can open ourselves up friendly Firefox. And remember to use the right protocol, and we'll see our hello world. And in fact, hello world reloaded will work as well. We'll see our app get rebuilt, we'll see our app get redeployed, and we'll see our reloaded. So there we have it. Remote development against any Kubernetes cluster, relatively fast. A lot of this depends on how you organize your development environment, how you manage synchronizing and re-updating based on file changes. But most of that really has nothing to do with Kubernetes anymore. You start to get back into the land of Node.js development or app-specific development. So there we have it. This technology allows me to develop on a home server, like I said, but also we can share our development boxes remotely. We can get really incredibly fast build times. But more than that, if I close my laptop or sleep my computer, for example, this remote environment is still up and running, which means that my coworkers can come check in on it, they can dev on it, they can bug fix it. It's a living incarnation of my development environment that's shareable, observable, etc. So we've gotten a lot here today. We've gone through a lot. I'll cut it short now. But if you have any questions, please post a comment. We'd be happy to do some follow-up videos. Thanks, everybody.